My name is James Mwangi, and I live in Nairobi, Kenya. Beyond my day job, one of my growing passions has been about the role that climate action can play in transforming the lives of the world's forgotten or omitted or excluded billions. Climate change and climate action can often seem paralyzing. The sheer scale of the problem defies description often. We talk about billions of tons of carbon dioxide emitted every year, tens of billions. We talk about trillions of dollars needed to manage a green transition. We talk about billions of people who will be affected in one way or another, millions of species lost, entire nations at risk of various consequences. It's very easy for any individual to feel essentially helpless in the face of what can seem like an inevitable onrushing tide. This is even more the case in places like Kenya, where I am from, where many of my fellow citizens haven't even had the opportunity to benefit from the fossil fuel based economy of the 20th century that led to a measure of prosperity and improved livelihoods for so many others around the world. For my countrymen and women, it can often seem like all that is happening is the lifestyle and livelihoods that they have depended on for generations are slowly or actually not even slowly, are rapidly and inevitably coming to an end. They can no longer grow their crops as the way they used to. They can no longer live where they thought they could because of floods. They can no longer anticipate the environment that they will be in. They are facing diseases that were previously not present in the places that they are living, all because the climate is changing. Just as importantly, they don't really have much of a role. At least conventional wisdom is they don't really have much of a role in changing this fate that they see approaching them. After all, the average Kenyan emits a tiny fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions of their counterpart in the United States or Europe or parts of Asia. They don't have that much to cut, even if they did commit to reducing their emissions. And so the question becomes, what can they do other than wait helplessly for others to do what could be done to avert this disaster? And waiting for the goodwill of others in the face of a dangerous and oncoming disaster is not a place that most human beings like being. So what if we changed the frame? What if we looked at the very fact that these people are a small part of the problem today and turned that into an opportunity? What if we embraced the power of small? Now, the first obvious way in which we should think about this population in places like sub-Saharan Africa very differently is, as we learned in biology and from our own lives, small can eventually become big. Things grow. The best example I can think of is to say, look at the greenhouse gas emissions of the average person living in rural China 40 years ago, and look at the emissions of their descendant or themselves today. The shift is radical, dramatic, and pronounced. Now, picture that playing out again and again, as we're seeing it do in country after country, as those countries make the jump into being middle-income countries with consumers and with new patterns of behavior and production. The impact could be disastrous. And so the first thing we need to keep in mind is that small can become big, and the cheapest emissions to prevent or avoid are the ones that haven't been committed to yet. That means that investing in putting the parts of the world that haven't yet built out a fossil fuel dependent infrastructure, putting them on a new trajectory at scale is one of the best investments we can make for humanity as a whole to avoid climate disaster. The second way that small can be really relevant is that small numbers add up over a large group. Any individual living in rural Kenya may have a very small carbon impact or climate impact on their own, but put together, it scales really, really fast. Getting an entire country to commit to clean and renewable sources of energy for powering their homes, powering production, even cooking, can very quickly add up to tremendous impacts for ecosystems. Convincing a large number of smallholder farmers not to adopt completely alien farming techniques, but to re-embrace the climate-smart techniques and tools that led to a form of agriculture for centuries that was in harmony with ecology and was in many ways less emissions intensive, is similarly hugely impactful if done at scale. But it has to be done at scale. And so the challenge then becomes, how do we sum up the small across many, many, many different changes to add up to a really big one down the road? I think maybe the last change that I would emphasize is a change in mindset. It's a change that recognizes that we are at a moment where we are recognizing that our ecological and climate footprint, each and every one of us, is too big to be sustainable. And so we need to look at those humans who have managed to live with a much smaller footprint and ask, what can we learn from them? And how could we build on the choices and approaches that they have made or have taken or might take in the future with our support and investment as we set a future direction for the global economy. That may lead us to embrace things like distributed production, because in many parts of the world, the heavy, centralized, and ecologically disastrous infrastructure of the 20th century has not been built yet. There are fewer vested interests. It's much easier to pivot to the kinds of distributed modes of production that exist today, that technology is making available today, and which make increasing amounts of sense. This applies also to how we live. Do we still need megacities in an age of Zoom? Might we be able to live and work in distributed communities that can be much more in harmony with nature, and where, by virtue of a smaller footprint, a lower impact on our ecosystem is possible? All of these are questions that do not necessarily yet have easy answers. However, I would say they all point in a consistent direction, which is we need to pay attention to the small, not just because we want to prevent the bad parts of the small getting big, but because embedded in much of the small are big lessons for us all.